Greetings, Audio Avengers. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for insightful and entertaining discussions of Marvel television. Well, folks, it has finally happened. The MCU TV shows stepped out from the shadows of Avengers past and present to deliver us a series based around an entirely new character. Is it right to say character? Maybe I should say characters. Either way, we have ourselves at least one Moon Knight. And to discuss our premiere episode, we've assembled the Storycast team to break down the episode's theme, other works of art that relate to or might even influence the episode, and more. In fact, because we never stop evolving here under the gamma radiation of podcasting, we're adding a few new segments at the end of these Storycast episodes to discuss costuming, a bit of narrative critique, and what this episode might portend for the rest of the series. I'm your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti, and as always, on Storycast, I am joined by two of the deadliest literary mercenaries.
I'm Amanda Marcotte. I'm a politics writer for Salon.com.
Hi, I'm Maeve Adams, an English professor at Manhattan College, where I also direct the Digital Arts and Humanities program.
Well, now the show is an official, real thing, and we've seen it. Amanda, how did it stack up for you compared to the trailer that we got?
Oh man, night and day. I admitted I was dreading this show because the trailer was so grim dark, and I was just like, look, I don't want to see another Batman movie, and I don't want to see Marvel rip off the grim dark Batman. I'm over it. But this episode was fun. It was hilarious. It was lighthearted. It moved. It did a lot of really innovative things with storytelling. Like the whole, we're not going to show you the action, we're just going to imply it thing was really fun for me. I wasn't bored for a single second. So, man, I kind of wish they had highlighted how fun it was going to be in the trailer.
What do you think, Maeve? Was that as entertaining as Amanda says?
Yeah, I also wasn't really sure what to expect based on the trailer. I didn't think we were going to get such a fleshed out version of Steven, who is so incredibly funny. And his comedy is both verbal and physical, and in relationship to these other really hilarious characters. His, colleague Donna is hilarious. I also didn't expect the gore. I didn't expect it to be as kind of I actually cringed at the beginning. I was like, and I nearly had to fast forward through the feet in the glass. I was like, that's a lot. But then I was reading up about two people who are going to be working on the show, Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, who apparently are collaborators regularly. And they love to combine comedy and horror in really weird ways. So they make these kind of indie films and they make other kinds of films, and have been recently brought on board with stuff like Moon Knight. And I think that made a lot of sense to me, that they like to blend weird horror, weird thriller with comedy and with drama in these sort of surprising and maybe unsettling kinds of ways. And so I actually really enjoyed that about it, even though I was having a hard time totally in my own body thinking about somebody sticking their feet into shoes filled with glass, because that sounds horrible. And the blood and the gore, later when they're in wherever they are, Austria or Switzerland or whatever country with, German, names of places. So I found that a little unsettling, but it makes a lot of sense to me in terms of trying to tell a story that isn't simply grimdark, is doing something really different with a kind of thriller vibe and with a comedic vibe. So I really enjoyed it.
It had infinite amount more cupcake trucks than I expected to have in a Moon Knight series premiere. So definitely way more fun than we thought. And Maeve, to your point, the physical acting of Oscar Isaac as Steven especially was really interesting. You really bought him as this introverted, awkward person when we know, he's used to playing these imperial characters lately, like in Dune, and obviously Steven's alter ego, Mark, will be quite a different person, I suspect. So really cool stuff, I think. So a lot happened in this episode. Obviously, Stephen Grant works at a museum, learns maybe there's something more to him than just sleepwalking, and why he's chaining himself to the bed when he wakes up in the aforementioned undetermined Swiss Austrian region, someplace with cottages. And before long, he's running away with a scarab beetle after having seen Arthur play judge as the sort of figurehead of Ammit here on Earth. And then it's basically a lot of comedy horror stuff like you're talking about, Maeve, and we get Stephen increasingly falling apart as he realizes time has passed, and then he's being pursued by these supernatural beings who are talking to him in his head. Before long, he is confronted again by Arthur in the museum, who basically tells him to give him the scarab back, or else he's really hung up on the scarab. Would definitely have a red herring here with that scarab. And then at the end, as this supernatural dog-type creature is pursuing Stephen, he finally gives in to the Marc presence that has been there all along, lurking in the background, and turns into Moon Knight and just eviscerates that weird creature. So quite an episode, Amanda. So I'd like you to talk to us about the theme of the episode. What did you see?
Identity. I think we talk about it a lot, but I was really intrigued by the way that this episode really thought about the kind of two ways that people imagine identity. There's the notion that identity is kind of a fluid thing that's always a process, that it's that it's socially constructed from various processes, and that it's constantly being constructed just every moment of every day. And then there's a more what I would consider conservative view of identity, which is that it is a fixed thing that you are, and it's very black and white. You either are one thing, you are another. And this was really illustrated in the conflict between what was happening with Stephen and Arthur Harrow's point of view. I think Arthur Harrow really was kind of the emblem of this more conservative notion of fixed identity. But what happened with Stephen in most of the episode, I think, was really engaging this idea that identity and authenticity of identity are much more complicated than we often give them credit for.
So what makes Arthur the fixed guy? And then I guess by extension, what signals to you that, besides the fact that there are multiple people inside of him, that Stephen / Marc is sort of more constructed?
Well, the Arthur part of this is really easy, right? He literally lays hands on people and decides if they're good or bad. And he repeats this notion over and over that you are exactly the same person from birth through life to death, right? That there's nothing you can do to change it, that you are who you are. There's no change possible, no process. It's always the same exact person. So I think that's kind of an interesting and classic idea that more people hold than you'd think. But the rest of the episode was way more interesting to me. And it made me realize that when we think of how people construct their identity, there's kind of 4 realms of which we kind of think of our identity. Like, we think of our identity as like our body, like our physical self. Our identity is also kind of our aspirational self, like what we imagine ourselves to be, right? And then there's the way other people see us. That's a way that our identity is formed. And then there's also just actually the kind of collection of experiences and memories that sort of, I think a lot of us think of as kind of your almost most authentic self. But I would argue that there is no such thing as an authentic self, that what we consider, that all these things are always kind of in flux with each other and people are forever changing. And what we consider authenticity is the feeling you get when there's some kind of cohesion between those 4 elements, that they all kind of hold together and create this illusion of a whole self. But as this episode shows, like, Stephen doesn't have the luxury of that in any way, shape, or form.
It's funny too, because Stephen, as a character, the show really foregrounds a questioning or making fun of maybe the idea of authenticity, because as a British man, he comes across as such a stereotype. His character is almost a caricature, like as if you were to imagine like an American dude trying to imagine what a British guy is like, the kind of self-effacement of himself, right? Like he walks out of his apartment building and he says to the guy selling the brooms, you're here every day. That's fine, man. That's fine by me. Cheers. Right. The kind of like, it doesn't even rise to the level of passive aggression. It's just passive, right? He's got this wry, dry sense of humor that's actually really funny. But there's almost this way in which he's almost emasculated by the representation. And part of me got the feeling that this is a character that's been put on, but not for the sake of trying to be something that he isn't exactly, but as a kind of performance of a struggle with the problem of authentic identity, the struggle to sort of be a person, particularly when you are a person with multiple selves inside of you that are also struggling to reckon with each other and sort of, make space for one another.
Steven's like not a real person. You really start to get this sense that he's unmoored in every way from what we consider the ways that we anchor ourselves in our identity. He doesn't control his body a lot of the time. He doesn't remember a lot of his life. He doesn't.
Yeah.
Other people, when they see him, don't see him at all. Like they don't, like their opinion of him is poorly formed. He's like a shadow man to a lot of other people. And, his aspirational self is he wants to be that's probably the most interesting part of him is he wants to be an Egyptologist. That's the only part of his personality that has real focus to it.
It's also where he's the most non-stereotypically sort of jokily British, right? When he's talking to that child in front of the model of the pyramid, and he's really engaging with her. He's really passionate about the stuff he knows about Egypt. And even when he's talking to Donna about the poster and the signage outside being wrong, it's clear that this is something he really, really cares about. And he's not joking, and he's not being jokey or self-effacing. He's very assertive in those contexts. He's really confident. And it's probably, it's funny because it's like, maybe it's just because it kind of speaks to my own sort of sense of myself, as a scholar, that I really love those parts of him, because I'm like, oh yeah, wonderful. You actually have these loves and interests that aren't always kind of compromising your maybe sense of your integrity. And I don't mean your honesty. I mean your sense of wholeness, right? You're kind of like, he's always kind of at odd ends, like trying to figure out where he fits in the world and with whom he fits in the world. So I loved those moments.
Maeve, one of the things Amanda's point makes me think about, though, is, this question of fixed identity as well as questions of free will, right? Because that's a lot of what Arthur's character is getting at, that there's this idea that you will do these bad things and therefore you might as well die. Where do you land on that? And do you think the show is sort of interrogating this question of choice and free will as part of this identity question, or are those two separate things?
I don't think that they're separate things. I think that they're bound up with one another, because Mark's relationship to Stephen has to do with control. And in fact, he says that at the end of the episode. Also, it's said to Stephen at other moments in the episode where he needs to give up control of himself so that Mark can take over. And so in a weird way, Stephen doesn't just give up control, he gives up choice over his actions. There's that moment in the cupcake van where the bad guy has like broken into the van, and he turns around and he attacks him with a cupcake, which has got amazing physical comedy. I laughed so hard watching that. I've never seen a cupcake used as a weapon before. So that's really fresh and new to me. I'm excited about it. And then it cuts to Mark at some point right after that, cuts to Mark being in control, and when Mark gives up control and Stephen comes back, he's got a gun in his hand and he's like shot this guy and he's like bloody, he's shot him in the head. So there, what we have is control is about taking away choice, and control then is about stripping Stephen of free will. And Stephen is terrified of the fact that he's just shot a man rather than putting a cupcake in his eye. So I think these things are really intimately bound up with one another, and also for this problem of identity, because that's the problem for Stephen. To go back to Amanda's point, the problem is consistency, that Stephen can't be consistent with respect to himself because he's not consistent in his choices, because he's lost control of himself.
And that was all really interesting, too, when you think about what Arthur Harrow told that woman that he killed in front of Stephen.
Oh, yeah.
That she's never done anything bad, but she will, right?
Right.
And this notion that that this capacity for bad, either you have it or you don't. Like, I think that what they're kind of playing at with the Stephen Mark character is that actually, in reality, most people have the capacity for both in them. And it's just a question of what is sort of drawn out of you, both in terms of your choices, but also your environment.
I'll be interested to see whether this is a question of whether Amit can actually see everything or whether everything is actually changeable, because those are two very different things. I'm not sure if we've talked about it on Storycast, but I feel like somewhere in here we have to have talked about with Loki or something.
Yeah.
That I believe all of us are somewhat skeptical of the concept of actual free will, which is to say this idea that choices are made in a vacuum and you walk up to the fork in the road and you could go left or you could go right, as opposed to the idea that like everything that is bearing down on you at that exact moment with your past experiences and the current environment and all of that stuff will lead you almost every single time, if not every single time, to do the exact same thing in the exact same moment if you've lived the exact same experience up to that point. So this show might be positing that that's bogus. I'll be interested to see that. But it also might simply be saying like, hey, Amit can't see the whole picture. And then to your point, Amanda, I wonder too if like the idea is also that one bad thing doesn't necessarily make you a monster. That old lady you guys were talking about that dies, you know, it's like clearly maybe something terrible is ahead in her future, but you know, if she shoplifts or whatever, does that mean she should have to die? Or even if she does something worse, like runs over somebody with a car, I don't know, man, does that negate her entire life? I don't know. It's interesting questions about like whether all of these experiences, which experiences define our identities, even whether they're like whether or not we can control our own destiny, so to speak. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting too. You raise a question for me about this notion of constructed and fixed identity, because it's almost as though the problem is that Arthur only believes in one, whereas we do navigate a constant problem of constructed and fixed identity. So like, for example, we talk about, and you brought this up a minute ago, Amanda, we talk about the social construction of identity. Sometimes when we talk about that, we mean things like the social construction of gender, right? So then there's this like fixed thing out there in the world that's this normativized idea of something that we have to grapple with as humans, right? Where we're constantly like, well, maybe I don't fit that normativized conception of binary gender identities or whatever. But that doesn't mean that simply because there is a social construction of gender, that gender identity is in fact fixed, right? That's why the social construction of identity has other facets to it. Like we are constantly in a historical process of socially constructing identity, right? Like the idea of what was American 10 years ago is different from the idea of what is American today, because that is constantly evolving. And then there's also the other dimension that's social, is the way we interact with others in a moment, right? That it's situational. And so at the same time that we grapple with fixed conceptions of identity that are social and socially constructed, we also live through a process of historical construction as well as social constructions of gender or identity, broadly speaking. They're happening all the time that are just situational. Like we sit down and do I feel like one thing or another, or how do I identify in this situation versus a situation with other kinds of people in it? So I feel like that's, you know, part of what you seem to be getting at, Amanda, that's, I think, really subtle and nuanced here, that Arthur just isn't subtle and nuanced.
There's I forget the name of the philosopher, but a friend of mine he has a physics philosopher, and he talked about how every moment in time is basically just a memory. And the kind of metaphor he used for this was when you're listening to a song, you're actually only ever hearing one note at a time. Your conception of a song as a piece of music is all of your memory until that moment in time. And that is an illusion that your brain creates. And I think identity works in the same way, because the fact of the matter is we are all very different people from one moment to the next. You know, I'm a different person when I'm talking to Marc and when I'm playing with the cat and when I'm talking to my colleagues or when I'm on this Zoom call with you guys. Like we are always constantly making these adjustments to who we are for the moment. And it feels seamless because we have a lot of practice at it. But I think a lot of us remember being an adolescent and how the expectations of adult identity performance kind of clash with the lack of maturity and experience to pull that off. And and you're just frequently very awkward.
Well, and hormones don't help that sense of coherence.
Yeah. And when I think of awkwardness in the sense that somebody's off or weird or inauthentic, a lot of the time it's just that they have failed to fake authenticity well. They failed to fake this cohesion between all of your constantly changing identities.
Well, I don't think it's fakery, though. I think to your point, to the excellent example, which I had never heard of, is a really beautiful example of listening to music and creating a coherence out of the memories and the moment. Because I don't think it's fake. I guess to go back to your point earlier, like we all take issue with this idea that there's something called an authentic identity. But I do think your language of construction is more maybe to the point of what you're talking about, that we are building something at all times that includes a past and a present. And to your point about aspirational views of self, includes a future or could include a future if that's how we're kind of imagining ourselves in a moment.
Amanda, we've talked about a few of the scenes that are involved in here, but are there any others that we haven't hit on that you feel like touch on this question of identity and construction versus fixed and all of that?
One of the things I always look for in a narrative to check if my sense of a theme is right is not just sort of what I get out of the story, but are there like ways that the writers employ symbols and jokes and motifs to back it up? And this episode had tons of it. No one can remember Steven's name.
Right. Definitely. I remember the security guard guy. He was calling him like Willie or something. No, it wasn't Willie. The Otter Watcher. What was he calling him?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Donna calls her Stevie.
Right. Who else? Anybody else that you guys can remember that doesn't remember his name? I mean, obviously, Khonshu doesn't really seem to... He calls him the parasite, which, is an interesting note.
Well, and then you have a really fun inversion kind of symbology, which is... Steven's problem is he's always the same body, but there's different personalities that go through it, right?
Yeah.
And then that's contrasted with his goldfish, who has two different bodies, but is, in a sense, the same goldfish.
And it wouldn't actually matter if it weren't the same goldfish, because that's how goldfish are,
exactly.
Right? Like that's Dory on Finding Nemo, which the pet shop lady invokes, right?
Like one goldfish is the same as every other goldfish functionally. And
they're all different goldfish.
This new goldfish is also Gus the goldfish. Like it's the same goldfish, just a different body.
Oh, damn. You know what? That actually makes me think of that line, right? Where he says, if you're Gus, I'm the Queen of Sheba.
Yeah.
Right. Which is perfect, right? Because he might as well be.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe she's in there too.
Yeah. I'm not sure one fin versus two fin is enough of a defining characteristic to make him not Gus, right? Like he appears to be behaving just as Gus would behave. Yeah, wow, that's wild. Think about there's two Gus's inside. Or there is one Gus with two bodies, and then there's a Steven and a Mark with one body, and there's some interesting.
The whole scene in the pet shop was very much here are our themes. In this throwaway scene about a pet shop where she's like talking both about how it's all the same fish, basically screw off, dude. But then also everything about him, the last time she talked to him, he was obviously Mark. And she's like, you're off, you're weird. It was her explicating that sense that other people have of awkwardness when you're not performing a consistent identity. So I thought that was, a lot of other characters say stuff like that to Steven, but like that was the most on the nose.
Yeah. She also implies that he's basically a goldfish because she says, when you were here yesterday, I said this, and he doesn't remember it. But the thing is that he's not a goldfish, right? That's the difference here, is that the goldfish is a goldfish or is two goldfishes in one tank or whatever. but he's not a goldfish. He's a person, and he doesn't have the advantage of being a goldfish who doesn't care if he doesn't remember what happened yesterday, right? Because they just swim along and do their thing and wait for the flakes to come down. And I think this again goes back to your point that this is the crisis for Stephen, that he doesn't just get to be a goldfish. It doesn't matter if he doesn't remember the stuff, right? And it's not even the times where he ends up like in the Alps with a jaw misaligned. Oof. God, the replacing of that jaw, I just was like, oh, stop, please. But yeah. I mean, it's really interesting when you think about it in terms of how he's wrestling with this problem of his, because he doesn't get a choice but to wrestle with it. Goldfish can just, swim off in its happy little swimmy life.
Yeah, memory of a goldfish, right? Stephen has it, but not for the reasons that the goldfish does. My last question on the theme in general, Amanda, is just that folks might notice we talked about identity before in other Marvel TV shows. We do seem to keep returning to this idea of like these tensions within identity. So I'm curious why we see so many superhero shows from Marvel touch on these questions of identity, and what about Moon Knight is different from some of the other stories?
I think superhero stories are obsessed with identity for a number of reasons. Probably the one that comes to mind the most quickly, though, is historical reasons, which is both a lot of early comic books were written like Superman and whatnot by Jewish Americans who were kind of using it as a way to comment on American identity from the perspective of outsiders. So they themselves were obsessed with identity, and the superhero has always been about having a fantasy identity, a self that is yourself, but somehow better, right?
Yeah.
Greater. A lot of superheroes, therefore, even have two names. Most of them, I'd say. For this reason, because I think that the original stories were often written by people that lived as a lot of immigrant Americans or children of immigrants or people of non-Christian, non-white ethnicities in a space where they are both American and then also treated as not American. So they're a little bit more likely to be interested in that question of how people's identities are changeable, depending on the circumstances. And the other reason is, honestly, comic books were originally written for young adolescents, children, teenagers. And I think, therefore, those are groups of people that are the most trying to figure out who they are and how to construct identity consistently in a way that makes other people like you. And therefore, these stories kind of just evolved to meet that need. And now you could probably make an interesting argument that one of the reasons that superhero stories have surged in the past 20 years and haven't gone away is this has been a time, this past couple of decades in the United States has been a time when we are all collectively obsessed with identity. And these stories just resonate with us. That said, I think that this story is doing something a little different than like a Captain America or something like that, where that's really more of a straightforward examination of the distance between lived experience and aspirational self. And that this one is a little more philosophical about the way that identity is constructed. I've never seen one really think about all the various aspects of how there's your body, there's the way other people see you, there's your memories, there's your aspirations, and each one of those is a different lens that we look through identity. And by forcing a character to break those apart very distinctly, you begin to see how much of identity is constructed in a way that I think other superhero stories have never quite gotten at in the way that just even this first episode of Moon Knight does.
Right, because Captain America was about, right, like, or Falcon and the Winter Soldier, right, was like kind of like, what does the suit mean? What does the shield mean? What does America mean? Right, it's about symbols. You had Loki, which was much more about all these different iterations of a person kind of going through slightly different experiences via the multiverse. But that's sort of, again, like fanning out a bunch of options, whereas in here, we're talking about this like the lens, as you said, the lens of identity. I think that's an amazing way to put it. That's kind of the unique special sauce of this show so far. Maeve, what do you think about that?
Yeah. That's really brilliant. The other thing that you have me thinking about is that this is kind of an inversion of WandaVision, because in WandaVision, she escapes her superhero identity into some normalized sort of domestic, except not, right? She doesn't quite fit in the same way that, Stephen doesn't quite fit. But here it's not escaping out of a superhero self into some kind of normalized, domesticated self. It's being split between the two constantly to never be able to sort of exit one fully without having it sort of always kind of haunting your daily life. And where, in what we have in this first episode is an exploration, not of the superhero, but of the normal guy who sort of has to live his life in being haunted by the superhero self, which I guess is also really different, right? So we think about something like, we don't talk much about DC around here, but like Batman, right? We have a guy who lives a normal rich man life, as it were, like you do. But his superhero self is a kind of secret identity, but it's consistent with respect to his normal self, which is also what makes that show so absurd. Like, Batman is just an absurd story. It doesn't make much sense in so many ways. But this is really grappling with how different it is. And I think also, there's something, I think there's something that about this that's going to be in the new Spider-Man story, right? Something about, trying to sort of forget all the things that you were,
sure,
and what happens when you try to detach completely, as if that were possible, then everything falls apart. And so this feels like a sort of a nice complement to that, because it's about the kind of twin halves of ourselves that aren't consistent, that aren't cohesive, that aren't coherent, that betray all our conceptions of identity as an authentic thing or an authentication process or something. And I'm curious to see what happens with it.
Well, before we move on, it is time for our first ever MTVC sponsor read. Now, don't worry, folks. Ooh. I'm not here to sell you toothbrushes or prepped meals or job posting apps, because the sponsor of the Marvelous TV Club is me, or rather, it is my latest and definitely my biggest project, which I call Latchkey. Now, who does not like the 80s and 90s? I'm talking Prince, the Wu-Tang Clan, Outkast, Tori Amos, Depeche Mode. I'm talking Beetlejuice, Ghostbusters, Dirty Dancing, Friday. You know who does like the 80s? The Moon Knight showrunners, because that scene, which we were talking about with the cupcake truck and Wham in the background, really excellent use of a really fun track that has had, I feel like, a resurgence in the last 10 or 15 years. People giving Wham their pop credit. It might not have changed the landscape of music, but they definitely knew how to write a jingle. So, what is Latchkey? Well, it's a retail store, but with its own little twist, because we are focusing only on the 80s and 90s. That means all the best vinyl records, of course, and we've partnered with artisans to craft exclusive candles, soaps, and bath bombs inspired by movies and music. Trust me when I say you have to try our upcoming vanilla and chocolate $5 milkshake bath bombs. We've got collectibles too, right? So if you're a fan of the 90s X-Men cartoons, for example, I definitely will have some really fun stuff for you. I need about another month to get all of our inventory online as I set up our actual brick and mortar store right here in South Philly. You can see some of the records we have available now at shoplatchkey.com. That's SHOP, latchkey.com. But the real ask for today is for you to follow the store on Instagram at shoplatchkey. So you can see the whole thing come to life, right? That's unboxing, really fun Marvel collectibles, Star Wars gift ideas, vinyl records, and more, plus seeing the store take shape over the next month or so. So if you want to support the MTVC, if you want to have that tangible connection to some of the best pop culture of the recent past, if you just like to have fun, follow us on Instagram at shoplatchkey, SHOP, latchkey, and see the whole thing come to life. All right, let's move on and talk about related works. Maeve, we got this theme about identity, fixed versus constructed, these lenses through which we can try to sort of understand the different ways in which identity might be defined. What is another prominent work of art or literature that also touches on this theme or idea?
I'm going to say something that I tell my students they're never allowed to do.
Uh-oh.
This is basically a tale as old as written history.
Are you taking us back to the dinosaurs? Wait, they didn't write anything down.
I mean, the dinosaurs, when they were writing down with their itty bitty hands, it was hard because, itty bitty hands, itty bitty arms.
So only some of the dinosaurs had itty bitty hands, right? I feel like there were some regular, I guess not really, they were just legs then.
I feel like a lot of them had weird little itty bitty arms and hands. I mean, I'm just thinking about T-Rex. I love them. Anyway, so, it makes a lot of sense. This is a show that invokes Egyptian mythology. It makes some sense to say that this is a really old kind of story, right? So we read stories about the relationship between predetermination, a kind of fixed notion of identity, and free will, all the way going back all the way to the ancients. So Oedipus, Achilles, right? Any story where fate and purpose is predetermined and people are kind of grappling with that.
Okay, so we're going to talk about mom's incest, or no, that's not. I feel like Moon Knight, there is a mom character, which I do want to talk about at the end of this show, but you're saying maybe what here?
Yeah, so, the thing about the ancient stories is that they're really, really different from the modern conceptions of predetermination or fixed identity. So I actually don't think that this is an ancient story. So here I am correcting course, the way I would ask my students to do. It's correct course on that one. That, in the sort of ancient narratives, there's like an oracle that tells you something's going to happen to your son. Let's say it's Achilles, and your mom is like, no, I can't have that happen. And Achilles goes off and he's like, he's always going to be killed on a battlefield somewhere. And his mother trying to save him is not actually about like preserving Achilles' happiness or something, like some like happy like life for Achilles. It's about Achilles fulfilling a different function in the world. That is a member of the family.
Okay.
Right. In modern stories that are about this, like take, for example, Kazuo Ishiguro's novel, Never Let Me Go. This is another really good example, but a really modern version of this story where you've got a bunch of characters.
I have it on hold at the library, so I haven't
heard of it. So Maeve, give me like the 101 on this thing.
Yeah, it's a really good novel. You guys would love it. It's really beautifully written. I'm thinking about teaching it next semester, actually. So it might be time for me to reread it. But it's about a group of characters who are at a school and they discover, because their teacher tells them, and I won't spoil this, but I'll give you the sort of bare bones of it. Their teacher tells them that they're actually clones, that they were built to supply organs to the people that they're the clones of. And that once they've finished donating all of their organs, they'll be the euphemism is they'll be completed. In other words, they'll die because they don't have any organs, right? To donate to their the bodies out in the world that are meant to be complete humans. And so the big conflict of the text is, how do these characters sort of fight back against a notion that their lives are predetermined, that their identities are fixed? They are merely donor bodies with no humanity to them, or no sense of humanity the way that we would think of, no sense of identity the way that we've been talking about, and all of its complexity. And so what I find interesting about this text as a comp for this show is that it's about the sense that if we can break away from this conception of identity as fixed or predetermined, then we find new resources within ourselves, that we become deeper, richer, fuller human beings. I mean, this is written in a post-Freudian era.
Yeah.
All that ancient shit written in a pre-Freudian era, right? The interiority of the self and its sort of infinite internal resources is important here. And I think that, of course, is exactly what we're talking about in this episode and perhaps this show, that the infinity of the self is unknowable. The infinity of the self is what helps define the self and its identity, and our grappling with all the layers of the self as part of how we self-realize.
The concept of a clone is so interesting to me in terms of like really unpacking some of these notions, because it gets back to what I said about like one conception of identity is the body, right?
Yeah.
And clones definitely challenge that. And it's not, but what's interesting to me about that is you see it a lot in science fiction. There's lots of great science fiction about clones, but we have clones in the real world.
Yeah.
And I don't mean like Dolly the sheep. I mean identical twins.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things that's always fascinated me. Not to get too like political in the weeds, but I was a reproductive rights journalist for forever. And one of the arguments that always drives me mad, because I don't think anyone believes it, and I'll prove it right now, is the notion that life begins at conception. And you would hear anti-choicers defend this by saying, well, that's when you're a full DNA, therefore you're the same as a full person.
Right.
And I would always say to them, when I bothered to debate them, so if you have two identical twins, it's okay to kill one?
Right.
Like, because at one point, those two human beings were one fertilized cell.
Right.
And at some point in the pregnancy, they split into two and grew into two separate people. Why do we think identical twins are two separate people? And I would say, just to get off the politics of that, I think they are proof positive about my point of like identity is constantly constructed. We consider them two separate people because they live two separate lives.
Right.
And they can't do that. You're not just a body.
Right. Well, and the other thing, Maeve, that you brought up that this, was really interesting was this idea that you're completed by the absence of everything, right? That it sounds like these clones, right? What completion is that everything has been taken from you. So your body, to that lens that Amanda was talking about, is utterly destroyed, is the aspirational view of the self for these clones.
Yeah.
But they have their own experiences and memories, it sounds like.
It's the giving tree.
Oh my God. Yeah, it is the giving tree.
Oh my God. That's great. Yeah. And it goes back to this sort of problem of identity that's connected to something else that we talked about last time, that is alienation. So what happens when identity becomes so, our sense of ourselves as human beings somehow gets detached from our sense of self, because to be completed, to be complete, right? It's almost a kind of too thin metaphor, right? Like, because when you're complete, you're nothing. When you're complete, you fully lost your humanity. Yeah, I mean, maybe, but I mean, it's beautifully told in the novel, and it's worth a good read. But yeah, I think, there's something there about that problem.
So let's return this to Moon Knight then and talk about some of the parallels or contrasts that you noticed between, Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go and this premiere episode of Moon Knight. What did you see?
So one of the things that Moon Knight highlights that I think is more subtle and implicit maybe in Never Let Me Go is that it adds the problem of what we might call utility or instrumentalization.
Okay.
So that Stephen is there to be the kind of normie out in the world, right? That has the job and, potentially could have a girlfriend. And Mark is the secret identity who gets to go and do the things at night in part because Mark has a job and exists. Because Stephen exists. Exactly. It's kind of hard sometimes to, unravel them a little bit here.
They're the same person. Yeah.
It's almost like they're the same person. But one of the things that I think is interesting about the way that this episode deals with this is that the fixed conception of identity is also an instrumentalized conception of identity. So that for Arthur, all the people around him are there to confirm his sacred view of the world, that they're just instruments of Amit's will, and they're instruments of his will he imagines himself to be the kind of Amit prophet or whatever, but he's also using these people for his own purposes, because he's all excited about the possibility that they could have killed Hitler. I can't imagine that Amit cares that much about whether or not Hitler died, right? Like, it's Arthur who cares about that. So Arthur's instrumentalizing all of these people in order to just fulfill a sense of his own self as a sort of sacred leader, like a cult leader. And so, part of what we have with Mark and Steve is that Mark is also using Stephen to enable to do something, and maybe also enable his secret identity. And that's a real problem for Stephen, who is like really full on rejecting this. And of course, we have some of this in Never Let Me Go, but all they want is to be able to experience love. And that doesn't feel like it's enough to me, or at least if we look at Moon Knight suggests it's not enough, that there's more alienation that comes from that battle.
The thing that I think a lot of people are talking about right now as the pandemic hopefully is winding down and people are going back to work, and we're having this discussion about the Great Resignation and how much the disruptions to work life caused, I think, a lot of people to look inside about their work and its identity, is that it goes back to this instrumentalization that you're talking about, Maeve. I think that right now, a lot of people are thinking on some level or another about how our work life under a capitalist structure does erase our humanity and turns us into tools. And grappling with what that costs us.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us would like to have a job that has meaning beyond, I think actually most people find a lot of fulfillment in feeling that their job is helpful, feeling like their job provides meaning to the world, that it's more than a paycheck, that it's more than just transactional. And I think that Stephen's job in particular at the museum really is a great symbol of this, because he wants to be a tour guide that teaches people about Egypt. That's a meaningful job that provides meaning.
Yeah.
He is a guy who sells stuffed scarabs to people.
Right. Right.
And
the stuffed scarabs are hilarious.
And I think a lot of people feel like they're the stuffed scarab sellers right now.
Yeah.
And they're beginning to realize how much of a soul destroyer that is.
Yeah, totally. It's funny you mentioned that, because another text that was kind of like, I couldn't remember what it was, but it was kind of flitting at the back of my mind when I was watching this. And because this show clearly is so interested in ancient culture, there's a political philosopher, Benjamin Constant, who writes about the difference between the ancients and the moderns. And he's got this like very basic argument that for the ancients, because there was scarcity of resources, the difference between freedom and non-freedom, so basically like liberties for the ancients, was to work towards a communal good. That was your primary purpose. You just, you work towards a communal good. So that like in Achilles, right? Like Achilles is only free so he can be part of a family, not so that Achilles can go and like explore his sense of self and be like a monk on a mountaintop or whatever, or like do yoga or whatever, right? Like it's about being part of a community and contributing to that community. Whereas for the moderns, because of the plenitude of resources, we can devote our liberty to exploring the self. And Constant is in conversation with Adam Smith, and he's also sort of offering a kind of anticipation of Karl Marx, but along the lines of what you're talking about, that this is the problem of modernity, is that liberty, the plenitude of resources of modernity, offers us the opportunity to explore ourselves and imagine liberty with respect to just the self. Also the community, but also just the self at times. And I think you're exactly right. This is the thing that, us modern humans, we were sent back into our little hovels to sort of shelter, waiting to get back out into the world. And part of what we realized was like, maybe the liberty that we have could be expended in more non-alienating ways.
I will point out that the ancient Egyptians used their liberty to amass enough stuff to be buried well.
Yeah. And make cool beer. They were real good at the beer. But no, it's true, right? Like the capitalism that Stephen encounters, right? The way that people look at him at his job is very similar to the clones that you're talking about in, Never Let Me Go, which is this thing that's like people are taking from you, what they can take from you, whether it's your job or your organs or your time. It's like, if that is how you define yourself, if that's that lens of identity, like that's a very grim way to think about existence for all of us.
Yeah. And he's an empty person, right? As far as other people are concerned, he might as well just be a clone there to donate organs. I was so struck by how he doesn't even have a name to most people he knows.
Yeah.
What you say is also really striking, because it was a line that really stuck with me from the episode, but I couldn't figure out why it was sticking with me. When Donna says to Stephen, something about, I hope you're not trying to make a bid for being a tour guide again.
Right.
Because that's never going to happen. And it's a joke. And he says something right before this. And then he says that, because that's actually really crushing. And it's the way it's delivered is comedic, but it's really, I mean, it broke my heart a little bit. I like could feel like all those times where there's like some vision you have of yourself and you realize you're just never going to get there. Right. But what the idea that this is crushing, I felt it, right? And I hadn't. You've given me language to understand that. That's like that. The fact that it was so crushing is because of all of that you're talking about.
Well, you, Dr. A, and Amanda give so much to our audience. It's nice to be one of the people who can give back a little bit for you guys. So let's talk about some new stuff in Storycast. I want to get into some details a little bit. We're always in the clouds, and I love the clouds. That's why we're here. But you guys are also really good at talking about the details, and so I want to drill into a couple things. And Amanda, I want to start with you because something from when we used to talk about Mad Men on the YouTubes, you were always really good at understanding costuming detail. So I wanted to ask you about Moon Knight and a costuming detail that might have jumped out to you. Did anything stand out to you as a component of this story that might have been important costume-wise?
So I love this because I feel like every other podcast is going to talk about the Moon Knight costume. Was it cool? Was it not? That's what everyone likes to talk about. I don't care about the Moon Knight costume. It's fine. Whatever. I was really into the way that they dress Steven throughout most of the episode with one sole exception I'll talk about in a second. But his colors throughout, not when he's in bed, but when he's at work, when he's on the bus, when he's kind of just living his life, in almost every scene, he is dressed in some variation of blue and gold. His shirt is blue and gold. The first museum scene, there's other scenes where he's wearing maybe like a tan shirt and then a bright blue jacket, but then they go out of their way to cast him against gold backgrounds, either in the museum or the bright yellow of the bus. So at all points in time, Steven is swaddled in blue and gold. And those are the colors of King Tut. Ooh. Those are the colors of the Pharaoh. And it's very explicitly underlined. You see him standing next to the King Tut book in the gift shop. So this is very obviously meant to be that. He is being associated with ancient Egypt in this beautiful way.
Even when he's getting dressed to go to the steakhouse when he thinks it's Friday and it's really Sunday, right? I think it's like a yellow tie with like a blue suit maybe or shirt, if I'm recalling correctly. Like there's definitely blue and yellow in that scene too. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's so brilliant.
Well, and when he talks to that little girl in the museum, she's also wearing blue and gold.
Oh,
yeah, that's true. She's in her school uniform, but yes.
And exactly. As Maeve is saying, that's when he's like connecting to like his most interesting and true self potentially.
Exactly. That's a classic costume designer trick, is to show two characters are simpatico is by dressing them in different patterns, but the same colors. And so that little girl, I think, was a symbol of who he could be. And I think the idea is that this non-man, this person who seems to have no relationships, no personality, etc., outside of his aspirations to be an Egyptologist, like he's going to find himself through that, is my prediction, based on the costuming. And that is why I think looking at costuming is always a really valuable thing to do.
I love this because if we think about identity through work, identity through labor, there is an alienated version of that for Stephen, which is at the museum gift shop. And then there's this other version of his labor where he actually aligns himself in some way, maybe not perfectly, but aligns himself in some way with Marc. And because the thing is that his Egyptian deity is not just driving Marc, it's also driving Stephen. And so maybe this is like the fulfillment of self is finding the job that really matters to you. Well, I'm here for that. This is great.
It's an interesting question because it's like the one scene that Stephen spends in a lot of time not wearing, well, he doesn't wear blue and gold when he's in bed, which is when Marc takes over, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's also not wearing blue and gold when he comes home from that ruined date and has that horrible encounter with Mark in the mirror and all that stuff.
Right.
He's wearing black in that scene. And
Right.
the Moon Knight's colors are white and black.
And it's the scene where he's like that set of scenes where he's the most shattered, right? He's in the base of the elevator looking for a contact lens, according to
Terrifying, that old lady.
exactly. But he's the most detached from a sense of himself.
I think it highlights the contrast between the aspirational Stephen, the person that he could be, which is like this Egypt guy who knows stuff and has a girlfriend and blah, blah, that he's not quite yet. And then this darkness that's tugging at him.
I love getting into all the things we enjoy about these episodes because that's why we watch them. Why else would we watch, much less listen to podcasts or talk on podcasts about all these things? But I also feel like it's good to dig into a little bit about, maybe what an episode left us wanting more or less of. Maeve, was there a narrative weak point of this episode that jumped out to you?
Man, oh man. I don't like the women characters.
Were there women characters besides the gift shop manager?
I mean, Donna is hilarious.
Yeah.
She's hilarious. And if this were a different show, I would be all for it. But because we basically have 3 female characters who they don't all get more lines than other female characters, like the little girl, I'm not counting her because I don't think she's coming back. But we've got Donna, we've got Dylan, and we've got Layla. And I think it's possible that they'll all come back in some way. Maybe Dylan won't come back as a significant character, but these are significant characters in the episode and potentially in the show. And the problem is that like they're superficial at best and they're caricatured at worst. So, Dylan is maybe the superficial character. And I don't mean she's superficial personally. I mean that she's written superficially. What we know about Dylan, we know that Mark has offered to go on a date with Dylan because Stephen has no recollection of it. So it's got to have been when Mark took over.
Right.
But unless Dylan started the job yesterday, why does she not know that Stephen is odd with respect to the guy who asked her out on a date? Because she's like, oh, you're so funny. You're saying things that are so weird. Like, unless Mark is taking over all the time while Stephen is at work, which doesn't make sense given what we've seen in this episode, there's like, I don't understand why she would date him. Like, either she's stupid.
She probably never talked to him more than 2 seconds before he asked her out on a date.
Maybe, but I feel like
Stephen's, again, rendered as a non-entity in his world.
Totally. You're totally right. And maybe, maybe I'm just so frustrated with Donna that I'm sort of reading outward from Donna, because I think Donna's the problem in this episode. Donna is a caricatured bitch boss.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's what she is. And it's tiresome. It's like, she's really funny. And whoever that actor is, I don't know her name, but she's great. She's a super talented actor and I want to see her in other things, but I want her to tone it the fuck down and I don't mean the actor. I mean, that's not her fault. Like, this is the script she's been given, right? It's too much. It's over the top. And if we don't have any other significant female characters, it renders all these women, these kind of like stock flat characters that are just there for the purpose of like developing these like deep and meaningful male characters.
Well, that was going to be my question to you, was like, is it that Donna needs to tone it back? Because I did, again, I'm just some dude, but like I enjoyed that character and performance. And I thought, the security guard was an equivalent like male performance. I mean, obviously Donna's on the screen more, but like we are clearly signaled that like everybody treats him in this way. But it was just that there was no counterweight. There was no female character that brought Donna was the main female character, and then that's what makes her depressing.
No, and I 100% agree with that. Like, if there had just been another female character who was a counterbalance to these sort of one-dimensional female characters, because Layla also is one-dimensional and kind of unbelievable. So he, picks up the phone, he calls her. She's like, I've been trying to get in touch with you for 2 months. Okay, fine. She's really worried about him. That feels believable. And then he obviously doesn't know how to respond to her. So he's like, who do you think I am? And she says, Mark, and he's befuddled. And then she hangs up the phone. And I'm like, honestly, if okay, so Mark, let's just turn you into Mark.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm like, I never know which one you're talking about, but no, I'm just kidding.
I know. It's confusing. It's hard to say the name Mark and not think about you. Speaking of identity, it's like if Mark were to disappear for 2 months and Mark were to call me and be like, hey, Maeve, or just, hey, and then we have some weird conversation where he clearly doesn't know who he is, I would be like, tell me where you are. I am coming to you. It's okay. You're going to be fine. I am your friend. You may not know that right now, but I wouldn't just hang up the phone. Like either Layla doesn't give a shit about him, which doesn't make sense given the beginning of that phone call, or I don't know, or something else. Or maybe we need more context. And look, I am willing to wait.
Right.
I will wait and figure out what these characters are all about. And it's totally fine if we don't have a meaningful female character in the first episode. But if I'm just taking the first episode on its own merits,
right,
I found this lacking.
I'm hoping they're doing a bit because Steven's mom is like not even a human. She seems to just be an answering machine.
Oh, I definitely have opinions on Steven's mom. In fact...
Wait, say more.
Okay. Well, then let's take us into the final part of our little details conversation. This is where I continue my dark path down a little bit of theory casting based on this theme that we talk about in Storycast. So, okay. What are we talking about? We're talking about identity and these like ideas of fixed versus constructed and these lenses around it. So one thing that I will say that's like a little small prediction is that we see clearly that Mark as Moon Knight is the classic Moon Knight in the robed garb and the pointy. Ooh, I even could put my little hood up. I'm wearing a little Moon Knight style hood. He puts it up and he's the classic Moon Knight, right? What does that tell you about who's going to be the Moon Knight in the suit? With the mask, who's rolling up his very nice sleeves, the guy we already saw in a suit this episode. That is going to be Steven's version of Moon Knight as he sort of gets more accustomed to the world in which he's actually operating in, as Khonshu takes accepts more that Steven is a part of this. So that's one minor prediction as part of this idea of constructed identity, that as Steven grows into this role, he's going to make Mr. Knight as the counterpoint to Mark's classically robed Moon Knight. What do y'all think about that one?
I like it.
I like that. I like that also because it will help us reckon with the fact that we've had this like weirdly sort of stereotypical British character. Yeah. So he's going to get more, I knew he was going to get more complex.
He is. He's going to get in his little, he's going to be all proper, right?
But he's going to get his cool outfit and
it helps tie together what I was saying because the one time we see Steven wearing black is when he's confronting Khonshu for the first time.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right. Good call.
Yes.
Okay. So let me fuck you up real bad now. The line that messed with me the most from this was the little girl who, as Amanda pointed out, is dressed in the blue and the gold, which signals to me that she is essentially someone to be taken seriously. She is an authentic person we should listen especially to what she's talking about around Egypt. And what does she say to Steven? She says basically, what does it feel like to basically have failed the test and not gotten into the afterlife? Okay, so settle in, because here's what this means. We know Mark's been around a while because Layla knows Mark's been around for a while, and Layla is the one calling on the phone, right? If we're going to borrow one piece of the comics mythology that we talked about last week in our preview, so again, hopefully this isn't a spoiler because we talked about it last week, it's that Marc Spector dies in the desert and is resurrected by Khonshu to come back as the Fist, right? He was a mercenary. He was doing stuff. So I think we can say comfortably that this body, the Oscar Isaac form as one lens of identity, is definitely Marc Spector's original body. And Marc Spector is the person with a past. But when he was brought back from the dead, there was what Khonshu himself in this episode called a parasite, a hanger-on, a second soul that was accidentally returned to this body with Marc Spector. And that is what Stephen Grant will discover about himself, that he himself failed to cross into the afterlife, whether he's from ancient Egypt or I don't know what we're going to sort of learn about where Stephen comes from. But I do think he was a hanger-on, an accident of being brought of this resurrection of Marc Spector. And that is why Khonshu hates him so much, because it's essentially Khonshu's fuck up that maybe put him in this body in the first place. So there is that. And then the last little detail I want to add about this is the mother. So we know Mark Spector is taking care of Stephen Grant. He's trying to protect Stephen Grant, or he wouldn't have bought him another fucking goldfish, and he wouldn't have tried to find one with one fin in order to keep Stephen chill, right? But he tried and failed to do that. So Stephen is on the phone with his quote unquote mother the whole time, which is number one, always going to voicemail. Number two, he gets a card in the mail that he uses to call her. Who do you think is sending that card? I submit the answer is Mark Spector.
Shit.
That definitely implies that Stephen might be very, very old indeed.
Yeah. Right. That Stephen's like an old soul who's like been brought back into a modern world that he doesn't fit with in some fundamental way. Damn.
Whereas all the Egypt stuff makes sense to him because he is actually, which is why he understands the Ennead and all the other stuff that they're talking about. Like, he might have just been like a legit Egyptian guy who's like was wandering around in their limbo or whatever and got sucked in along with Mark Spector. I don't know. All this stuff about identity is like really what crystallized those theories for me. So I wanted to put those out there for you guys just to ruminate and marinate. I look forward to being very wrong about some or all of this, but if I'm right, you heard it here first.
Well, and I would point out that while we don't do a lot of theory casting on Storycast, like I really wish more people would, when they are theory casting, think about things like themes, characters,
right?
It's plot, etc., because it might sharpen their predictions.
Right. It's not a Professor X. Well, I guess we know he's coming in Multiverse of Madness, but you know what I mean? It's like it's like, what are the idea that Wolverine would make in a random appearance or whatever in here has no connection to the story, but the idea that this, conception of Stephen as this lost soul, feels like something that could play a lot into the things that we're talking about.
Do you think that the little girl is like an avatar of Khonshu? Like there's a little girl who's like shown up at the museum, but that when she says that thing that you didn't make it through the field of reeds, the little girl isn't saying that. Khonshu has kind of entered her consciousness because she knows something. Because she obviously, I think it doesn't feel like she's not a little girl in the museum.
I think that's once again like a horror trope. Like
yeah, exactly.
Children are occasionally like uncanny.
They can like see past the veil of our normality into like the greater truth or whatever.
I suspect they drop that kid and it never comes up again. And it's just the uncanny child.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because the idea with that a lot is that children are innocent and can see through the veils that we put up with our, again, elaborate identity construction of which they are not experienced at.
Yeah.
Well, okay, enough theory casting. I just wanted to talk a little bit about identity and how much I was like, oh my God, everything is making sense to me. And I understand, again, all this will probably not come true. But again, if it does, It
was fun to flex those muscles, though.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, that's my dark path. It's
like doing split squats or something and, feeling sore the next day. Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, no Mephisto references, though. I'm very proud of myself. All right, look, enough. We've really brought a lot to this episode. I thank you both so much for this. Dr. A, while you're cooking up your next sort of, master plan in your lab, where can people find and follow you?
You can find and follow me on Twitter at Maeve Adams.
Amanda, when you're out there speaking truth to people who aren't ready, the Cassandra of the internet, basically, where can people find and follow you?
I'm at salon.com every day, and you can always find me on twitter.com, but I will probably ignore you.
Or tell you something weird about where you're coming from, like you didn't pass through the field of reeds.
Look, a lot of people have a lot of dumb shit to say to Amanda on Twitter, so do not begrudge her the fact that she is mostly ignoring the mentions. It's what happens when you have 80,000 followers.
No, seriously, follow me on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, she still says a lot of interesting stuff. She might not hear your interesting thoughts. Look, all right, legendary listeners, that's our show for today. We will be back next week with Character Cast to get into these characters, as we've had 2 episodes to digest them and the various Marks and Stevens and Arthurs of it all. So I can't wait to talk to Jesse and Christine about that. Please consider giving Latchkey a follow on Instagram. Again, that's at Shop Latchkey, SHOP Latchkey. And it's so much fun to put this story together. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. If you're enjoying this show, though, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple so we can rise in those search rankings as Moon Knight takes shape. It would mean the world to us. And if you want to talk with me some more, I'm at the Marvelous TV Club Facebook page. I'm on the Twitter. I'm at the Instagram. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Marc Faletti. That's Mark with a C, just like Mark in this show. F is in Frank, Aletti. All right, gang, let's put some glass in our shoes and get serious about our faith.
I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that.
Not doing it. Never.